Yeah, thank you so much, Marco, for that incredibly kind introduction. And yeah, I'm extremely happy that you or anyone really at this point has read my work and drawn inspiration from it. And also wanted to say thanks to you and the Neural Mechanisms team for organizing this. So I have tuned into several of the sessions, and every time I have, it's been a really great kind of injection of awesome ideas about the kinds of things I work on, and I'm really grateful because I also know it's a ton of work. So today I'm going to talk about this paper called Does the Brain Respect Basic Emotion Theory? I'm breaking with the convention in philosophy where titles that are questions are always answered no, and actually defending basic emotion theory from a recent sort of attack from the psychological constructionist camp. I will mention that the paper goes into a lot of empirical details, and it's quite likely that at some point I sort of get lost in the weeds of some of them, and we'll have to kind of catch up to go through the main points. My goal with this paper, as it will become apparent, is to make both a contribution to the philosophy of emotions, in particular debates about whether basic emotion theory, a theory attributed to Paul Ekman, and Carol Izzard and others, is a viable option in the philosophy of emotions, as well as a contribution to the philosophy of neuroscience, in particular the use of functional neuroimaging in order to test our what's called cognitive ontology, or our taxonomy of good psychological categories. And so the goal of this paper is to really make a contribution to both literatures and to actually bring the philosophy of emotions literature in contact with some exciting developments in the philosophy of neuroscience. So the main topic of this paper is about whether neuroimaging studies, in particular functional MRI studies, pose a challenge to basic emotion theory. Basic emotion theory at a gloss holds that humans universally possess emotions which are basic, such as anger, fear, disgust, surprise, and happiness. Currently in emotion research, there is what's called the new wave of psychological constructionism, and this new wave of psychological constructionism holds, among other things, that humans do not possess basic emotions. There's no set of emotions that we all have as the product of our development, and that in fact emotions are the product of learning and acculturation. I'll make these theses more precise later. The target, the direct target, the sort of proximate target of my paper is a meta-analysis of neuroimaging data conducted by Kristen Lindquist and colleagues in 2012. This is a univariate meta-analysis of fMRI data, and Lindquist et al. Claimed that this study shows that the brain does not respect the categories of basic emotion theory. There is, according to them, no region specific to a particular emotion like anger, and hence the brain has no fear system, anger system, etc. Psychological constructionists, notably Lisa Feldman-Barrett in the recent book, How Emotions Are Made, have taken this study to be a huge strike against basic emotion theory. And I will note, as it becomes important later, that this is an example of neuroimaging-based cognitive ontology revision, or the idea that one of the measures of our psychological categories is whether or not they correspond to localizable brain mechanisms. So I have two arguments or contributions in this paper, one to the philosophy of emotions, the second to the philosophy of neuroscience. In this paper, first I argue that Lindquist et al.'s results are actually compatible with the view on which basic emotions map onto distributed yet overlapping brain networks. The specifics more later. I argue that this form of overlap, or this model, would not itself be problematic for basic emotion theory, as some psychological constructionists have suggested. That will be, establishing that point will be sort of the bulk of the presentation. And then I'll talk a bit about how new studies that use multi-voxel pattern analysis, or MVPA, an application of machine learning techniques to neuroimaging data, support or provide, or at least fit with, and perhaps support in a positive sense, this distributed overlapping picture. And the brain may respect basic emotion theory after all. I also draw a broader philosophical lesson for the use of neuroimaging to test our cognitive theories. Previous theorists have noted that confirming or disconfirming cognitive theories with fMRI depends on many factors, including the empirical commitments of the psychological theory, bridging assumptions about the brain. Adina Roskis and Marco Nathan and Guillermo del Panal have stressed this. I'll go into a bit more detail later. My claim in this paper, drawing a contrast between Lindquist et al.'s mass univariate analysis and what multi-voxel pattern analyses show with regard to whether we can identify neural substrates for basic emotions, I claim that methodological assumptions also inherently shape the cognitive interpretations of fMRI, and thus there are no methodologically innocent matches or mismatches between psychological categories and brain activity patterns. Put slightly differently, we can only say that the brain either fits with or does not fit with our psychological categories relative to some analytic technique that we've adopted. As an outline for the rest of the talk, I'm going to give a very quick background on basic emotion theory versus psychological constructionism. There's a lot of detail I'll have to gloss over here. I will try to, at various points, point towards some of the complexity and the nuance surrounding these psychological theories. Then I will talk about the psychological constructionist critique of basic emotion theory and the role that neuroscience data, particularly Lindquist et al.'s meta-analysis, has played in this technique. And then I will present my argument that the brain may respect basic emotion theory in the form of distributed overlapping networks. I'll briefly address some objections on behalf of the psychological constructionist, and then I will present briefly some studies suggesting that multi-voxel pattern analysis may actually be detecting the kinds of distributed overlapping brain networks onto which basic emotions may map, although here I will suggest some interpretive caution and not just say that basic emotion theory is true because of MVPA, which I think would be irresponsible, and then I'll briefly conclude. Basic emotion theory, as I said, is the idea that humans, by dint of development and evolution, possess a core set of emotions. Usually, basic emotion theorists talk about how an elicitor will then engage an automatic appraisal mechanism, and then that will execute an affect program. So maybe you see a snake, and that causes you to execute the affect program of fear, and you have a distinctive facial expression, distinctive physiological changes, etc. I'll note here, because it is important later, that there are at least two senses of basicness that might matter for the discussion. This comes from Scarantino and Griffith's paper in 2011. An emotion is psychologically basic if it is the constituent of other emotions. So anger and disgust may be basic and then form contempt. And an emotion is biologically basic if it has developmental origins and characteristic biomarkers. The idea of biomarkers will play a huge role in the talk. Psychological constructionism, on the other hand, claims that emotions arise out of domain general psychological ingredients like core affect, memory, and concepts. Importantly, that emotions are the product of learning and enculturation rather than development. And there are a couple different ways of understanding this thesis. Sometimes the emphasis is on individual variation, so that fear does not refer to any stable psychological kind, even for individuals of a culture or even for individuals at the same time. This would be the idea that we talk about the word fear, but it doesn't refer to the same biological reality each time that we experience it. And also, psychological constructionists sometimes emphasize cultural variation, claiming that different cultures have different emotions. For example, Lisa Feldman Barrett argues that it's plausible that certain groups of Inuits don't have the emotion of anger. I'll say it's important here to note that psychological constructionists all agree that there are no biologically basic emotions, that there's no core set of emotions we share. Basic emotion theory entails that there are biomarkers that are consistently and specifically associated with emotions. And here, consistent and specific are terms of art. So consistent would mean that different bouts of the emotion will activate the biomarker. So maybe disgust always elicits a characteristic gape face. And specific means that the biomarker does not occur in connection with other emotions. So maybe the gape face occurs in connection with disgust, but not anger. Consistency does not entail specificity, so it can be the case that it's always wet, the sidewalk's always wet when it rains, but it's not the case that the wet sidewalk means that it rained, because it may also mean that there was a sprinkler. Basic emotion theorists have pointed to biomarkers for basic emotions, including autonomic nervous activity, facial expressions, cardiovascular activity, etc. Many studies, which I will not review here, suggest that there are no biomarkers for basic emotions, or that we have not found them. So people have disputed that there are distinct physiological, facial, or brain-related signatures of basic emotions. This is well reviewed in Barrett, 2006 and 2012, as well as the How Emotions Are Made book. And philosophers tend to agree that at least things are looking bad empirically for our favorite sort of basic emotion categories. I'll mention philosophically there are kind of three standard responses to this no one-to-one correspondence. One is a kind of hidden unity, so there are biomarkers, but we haven't discovered them yet. The second is revisionism. There are basic emotions, but they just don't correspond to the ones that we have. So there are basic emotions, but they aren't things like anger, fear, and disgust, which Scarantina raises. And psychological constructionists, as I've mentioned, advocate giving up on basic emotions altogether. So just as there's a debate about the status of biomarkers for basic emotions in the broader literature, there's a debate about whether neuroscience supports specific brain-based biomarkers for basic emotions. And there are a series of neuropsychology studies that have led basic emotion theorists to claim specific region emotion associations. So this often comes from human neuropsychology. So lesions to the amygdala will blunt fear responses, and there's a very well-studied patient SM who has bilateral amygdala lesions and allegedly has otherwise normal emotional responses, but just does not exhibit fear or startle in response to snakes and spiders and haunted houses and those kinds of things. And similarly, the anterior insula is associated with deficits in disgust. These studies, as reviewed by basic emotion theorists, have sometimes suggested that specific regions of the so-called emotional brain, like the amygdala, are specifically associated with particular basic emotions, like fear. In the influential study that I'm going to critique, Lindquist and al. Argue that a mass univariate analysis of functional fMRI data suggests that, in fact, the brain does not respect the categories of basic emotion theory. Their basic strategy is to identify emotional brain areas, see if those areas are consistently and specifically associated with particular emotions. Their stated goal in this paper is to address not basic emotion theory itself, but a thesis called locationism, which is the thesis that the brain has systems that are dedicated to particular emotions. And psychological constructionists consider this study to be a major problem for BET, as I'll mention later. I take it because they think that basic emotion theory implies locationism. So in their meta-analysis, Lindquist et al. Took hundreds of neuroimaging studies of emotion and defined a neural reference space for emotion. So these are areas that were likely to crop up generally in studies of emotion. And then they performed a set of analyses listed below to see if regions that are consistently associated with an emotion, so you note that neuroimaging studies of fear tend to modulate activity in the amygdala, and then ask, is that area specific to that emotion, where specific here would mean that it wasn't modulated by anger and sadness, etc. So effectively, their meta-analysis provides estimations of the consistency and specificity of brain regions for basic emotions by being a meta-analysis of hundreds of studies where people were presented with emotional stimuli of a specific sort. while Lindquist et al. Found some evidence of consistency, so cases where, say, the amygdala was consistently activated by fear, they found no evidence whatsoever of regional specificity for basic emotions. So their study finds many violations of specific associations between regions and emotions like the amygdala and fear, anterior insula and disgust, orbitofrontal cortex and anger. And they found that every region in this space is significantly modified by multiple emotions. So as you can see on the left, the anterior insula was actually most heavily modulated by sadness, but also disgust and fear. The amygdala was not modulated just by fear, but significantly to disgust and anger, and so forth. They also note that many regions that come up in the reference space for emotions are associated with domain general cognitive functions, such as language and memory and the use of concepts, which will become important for their interpretation of the data. So what Lindquist et al. Claim in this paper is that these findings, where no region is specialized for a particular emotion, suggest fit better, I should say, with the psychological constructionist view rather than the locationist view. And so, because it'll become important later, and also just so you kind of have a sense, they claim that their data fits really well with so it fits badly with a model where the brain has locations specialized for these basic emotion categories, and that it fits much better for something which they call the Conceptual Act Model, which I'll have to say a bit more about. The Conceptual Act Model has two major components, conceptualization and core affect. So what the CAM model claims is that emotions arise when people conceptualize their fluctuations in what's called core affect, which means continuous fluctuations of valence and arousal in particular ways. And so according to this view, you might experience this bodily effect of trembling seen in the upper right, and this might correspond to sort of being keyed up in a certain way and certain physiological changes and expressive changes. But that trembling can either be interpreted, if you interpret that to be excitement based on the context that you're in, or fear based on the context that you're in, you will then experience that emotion only when you come to understand your bodily experiences in this particular way. The Conceptual Act Model entails that there are no sort of biological markers that are always associated with an emotion, because an emotion only becomes such a thing when we come to have a particular concept. And I'll mention that the Conceptual Act Model is taken to explain both variation in emotional expression in an individual, so why someone who's experiencing fear doesn't always react the same way, but also why cultures that have different emotion concepts may actually experience different emotions. So now that we have Lindquist et al.'s study on the table, I'll mention again just that psychologists like Lisa Feldman-Barrett have taken these findings to be almost decisive against basic emotion theories. You can find in chapter 1 of Barrett the idea that, you know, there's this long history of searching for biomarkers of basic emotions and equivocal sort of back and forth research, but that this is the study that looks at every part of the brain, sort of seat of the emotions, to see if you can find specialized structures, and doesn't find any. So it's taken to be a major challenge for basic emotion theory by the sort of new wave psychological constructionists. I want to back up for a moment and mention that this is an example of a trend becoming popular called cognitive ontology revision. The figure on the left is from a paper where Agatha Lenardowitz, Russell Poldrack, and others tried to use neuroimaging data to test a hypothetical ontology or taxonomy of cognitive control constructs like response inhibition and working memory. And the basic idea here is that neuroscientists and psychologists are increasingly claiming that one of the measures of a good psychological category or construct, if you will, is that it aligns with patterns of brain activation as measured through neuroimaging. And here, the philosophically minded audience member might say, well, you know, is it really possible that we can look at a brain scan and determine that our psychological categories are wrong? And others have held that view, so I just wanted to say a bit about the conditions under which neuroimaging may be informative about our psychological theories in the first place. You can see that I'll use some of these conceptual resources in my reply to the claim that Lindquist et al. Study is a challenge to basic emotion theory. I'll mention just briefly the neuropsychologist Max Coltheart is actually famous for arguing that neuroimaging data cannot overturn our psychological theories because psychological theories do not make predictions about patterns of brain activation. And that was a sort of bold claim that people like Adina Roskies and Marco Nathan have then challenged by trying to specify the conditions under which neuroimaging can be used to test our psychological theories. The general picture here, which is one that I endorse, is that linking cognitive theories to patterns of brain activation involve a set of what Adina Roskies has called in a kind of Lakatshian mode auxiliary hypotheses, and what Marco Nathan and Guillermo del Pinal call bridge laws. But there are assumptions. So there are assumptions that are sort of needed to link patterns of brain activity to our cognitive theories. So I just want to show an example of how this would go, and then I will sort of use this same way of thinking to assess Lindquist et al.'s claim that that the univariate meta-analysis showing a lack of regional specificity challenges basic emotion theory. So imagine the psychological hypothesis that empathy involves simulating or experiencing pain, and that we want to test this using neuroimaging. Well, one way we could do this would be to use the following auxiliary or bridging hypotheses. So one, empathizing will recruit pain areas. Why? Because if you actually feel pain, the parts of your brain that support feeling pain will be active. Hypothesis two, maybe past studies have shown, although people who've been looking at multifunctionality in neural systems know that this isn't in fact true. But if it were, say that the anterior cingulate cortex is a pain area. So studies link ACC activation to pain. And then now we seek evidence that empathy tasks modulate bold activity in the ACC. So in this case, we might say, yeah, it's awfully looking like empathizing is recruiting pain areas. And as I've pointed out, and as others have pointed out, often the reason why cognitive inferences from neuroimaging are bad is because we use bridging assumptions that are implausible. For example, the auxiliary hypothesis here linking a particular area uniquely to a particular psychological function is one that we ultimately ought not to trust. So in my criticism of Lindquist et al., I'm going to argue that either, and some interpretations of their interpretation of either what is entailed by basic emotion theory or what is true about the brain is going to be questionable. I'll note that Max Coltheart calls things like auxiliary hypothesis one, that empathizing will recruit pain areas, a neural embellishment of a cognitive theory. So the idea being that we're not testing some kind of pure cognitive theory that could have any implementation, but that we're testing a cognitive theory that has a particular neural implementation. And I think it's fair to say that locationism is a sort of neural embellishment of that, which I'll come to in a moment. Okay, so I want to say if Lindquist et al.'s results contradict basic emotion theory, it is because basic emotion theory, for one, entails locationism. So the idea would be if basic emotion theory is true, then the brain has structures or systems dedicated to basic emotions. One actually could challenge that, and Lindquist in their paper, Lindquist et al. Say, well, maybe basic emotion theory isn't really committed to locationism, but I actually think that it quite plausibly is. So if an affect program is a specific sequence of muscle movements and visceral activity and so forth, and that the sort of control centers for these things are located in the brain, then I think it's plausible that basic emotion theory entails something like locationism at some level of neural analysis, which we can talk more later. and also that their evidence shows that locationism is false. And here, as I've indicated on the slide, I'm going to agree that locationism is a reasonable neural embellishment of basic emotion theory, and I'm going to deny that their evidence suggests that locationism is false. Why? Because basic emotions may map onto distributed overlapping networks rather than individual regions. Okay, so the first thing to note is just that locationism, the idea that the brain has some system dedicated to each basic emotion category like anger or fear, doesn't imply what we might call regionalism, which is that these basic emotion categories either map on to individual regions or that individual regions could not be shared between basic emotions. I'll say more on that in a second. Put differently, there may be other brain structures like distributed networks specialized for each basic emotion. Lindquist et al. Actually acknowledged this potential, writing, "It remains a possibility that we failed to locate a brain basis for specific emotion categories because emotion categories are represented as anatomical networks of brain regions." You might think that this is a kind of large admission, but nonetheless, psychological constructionists take Lindquist et al.'s results as they stand to be an indictment of basic emotion theory. So I'll explore why to the best of my ability. So my claim, put simply, is it's possible that basic emotions map onto distributed overlapping networks. And according to this view, each network could be specialized for basic emotion, even though no individual region is. And this is actually consistent with Michael Anderson's neural reuse picture, where kind of higher level cognitive capacities map onto large-scale brain networks, and individual regions perform some kind of functional component, some component function for that higher level capacity. As the picture on the left, you can see the lines, either solid or dashed, would indicate networks for specialized for particular basic emotions. And here you would have specialization emerge at the level of networks, even though each region is recruited for multiple of those networks. I think that I'm actually taking Lindquist et al.'s results of their meta-analysis at face value in what follows. So I'm saying, yeah, if what they say is true, there's no region specialized for an emotion, which is actually true in the left, but that this is still compatible with network specialization for basic emotions. As I mentioned, this is maybe a common situation in cognitive neuroscience, and so it could be that even though the anterior insula, which we know, is recruited for what seem to be a bunch of different cognitive functions, it's involved in not only the emotion disgust, but also sort of taste and addiction and craving. Even if that region is multiply deployed, it could be that it's part of a network, say the one in green, that's specialized for disgust. Nevertheless, as I mentioned, psychological constructionists like Barrett frequently take Lindquist et al.'s study, which shows a lack of regional specificity, to be a problem for basic emotion theory. The way I make sense of this, again, using this kind of auxiliary hypothesis framework, is that they endorse the following theses. One is overlap, so that the neuroanatomical overlap between emotion categories that would be present on this kind of picture signifies functional overlap, which is another way of saying basic emotions must share functional components with each other. And the second auxiliary hypothesis, or the third one, would be distinctness, which is that functional overlap itself is either inconsistent with basic emotion theory or favors constructionism over basic emotion theory. In other work of mine, I have questioned whether neuroanatomical overlap actually signifies functional overlap. There's sort of two possible violations. One would be, well, maybe gross anatomical overlap, like the amygdala seems to be recruited for fear and anger, masks some kind of finer grained divisions within the area. So maybe the amygdala is half for anger and half for fear. I call this the kind of subdivide and conquer strategy. So And then Dan Bernstein and others have written about the idea that, well, maybe regions kind of have radically context-sensitive functions. I'm actually going to gloss over those details today and just endorse overlap as well. So I'm going to say, yes, this neuroanatomical overlap quite plausibly signifies functional overlap between the emotion categories. What I'm going to argue against is the idea that this form of overlap would be a problem for basic emotion theory, or that it favors psychological constructionism. So in this part of the paper, I talk about whether neural and hence functional overlap is problematic for basic emotion theory, and I answer with a resounding no. So I claim that this sort of overlap between networks for basic emotions would only be problematic if one of these four things would be true. First, if basic emotions just can't have functional constituents, maybe they're sort of true psychological primitives, then this might be a problem. Second, if good psychological categories always have their own distinct neural real estate, then these would be sort of overlapping and hence bad categories. Third, if different basic emotions in particular cannot share functional constituents on pain of violating basic emotion theory, or number four, if the specific functional constituents shared by basic emotions are indicative of domain general cognitive functions of the sort that constructionists think are involved, like language, or concepts, memory, and so forth, because in that case, the sort of overlap between different emotions could suggest that, say, memory is playing an important role in determining sort of which emotion you're experiencing. I take number 1 and 2 to be kind of easily defeated, and then I feel like I need to say a tiny bit more about 3 and 4. So I think the first idea, either that basic emotions are true psychological primitives, or the claim that good psychological functions need their own neural real estate, are both non-starters. So I think psychological basicness would entail that the emotion like anger can maybe be combined or recombined to form more complex emotions, but that it just simply doesn't mean that anger has no functional constituents of its own. And I think this just falls out of the idea that basic emotions consist of an appraisal mechanism, which monitors the elicitors, and an affect program that is a suite of different physiological and expressive responses. So I think it's just sort of not true that basic emotions lack functional constituents, even though theorists actually on both sides, constructionists and basic emotion theorists, will sometimes talk about psychological basicness as psychological primitiveness. And again, for general reasons related to Michael Anderson's neural reuse theory, I think the idea that good psychological categories are completely neurally distinct or kind of have their own neural real estate is also a non-starter. So Broca's area is recruited for a bunch of functions like speech production, but also non-speech motor imitation, but also visual pattern learning. And I think it's fully possible that those three things I mentioned, speech production and, say, visual pattern learning, are good or distinguishable psychological categories, even though they share some constituents in common. Okay, so then the third idea is that, well, maybe, you know, this kind of neural overlap isn't generally bad for psychological categories, but that it's inconsistent with basic emotion theory. And I think that actually neural overlap is not only consistent with basic emotion theory, but that basic emotion researchers have already, whether they know it or not, articulated the idea that different basic emotions share functional constituents. And here I just want to go through 2 examples quickly. My claim is that shared functional constituents between basic emotion categories may actually be quite low-level expressive or physiological components. So I'm going to show one example of action units in the facial action coding system for basic emotions, and the second, neural circuits for fear and anxiety, and I think these will suffice to get the view across. So basic emotion theorists use what's called the facial action coding system to look at the distinctive patterns of facial expressions associated with different emotions. And action units are, as seen on the left, are things like the inner brow raiser and the nose wrinkle. They're the sort of smaller, they're the sort of tiny muscle movements that make up the whole facial expression. According to basic emotion theorists, as you can see on the right, basic emotions have distinct assemblies of action units. So sadness is associated with action unit 15 and 25 and 1 and 4. But importantly, something that's not articulated very explicitly is that basic emotions share action units, or these action units are heavily recycled between these different emotions. And so you can see, for example, surprise and disgust share action unit 25, which is the lips parting, and action unit 6 is shared by disgust and anger, which is the cheek raiser, and so forth. And so if you look at the very fine-grained, sometimes detailed depictions of action units, you see that they're heavily recycled. So if there was some area of the brain that controlled, say, action unit 6, then that part of the brain would be recruited for disgust and anger. Okay. All right. The same goes for fear and anxiety, which are behaviorally and neurally dissociable, despite their phenomenological similarities and despite having overlapping neural real estate, as I call it. So there's a double dissociation in animal research of anxiety between anxiety, which is a response to uncertain threats, and fear, which is a response to more certain threats. In particular, it's known in rodent models that lesions to the central amygdala affect fear, so whether an animal will freeze in response to a tone or a noxious stimulus, but not anxiety or avoidance-like behaviors, and that lesions to the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis will affect anxiety or sort of avoidance behaviors, but not the fear or freezing response to a proximal stimulus. At the same time, fear and anxiety have over other areas that overlap, including the paraventricular nucleus of the thalamus, and it is thought by some that the PVT is a kind of arousal region that affects the kind of strength of both responses. This is just a depiction here of the behavioral paradigms. So researchers study fear by things like freezing behavior to a shock or a loud tone, and anxiety as the rat's response to being in an environment like one where there's a mat that can shock you if you walk on it, and so you have to sort of avoid this mat, and it's associated with stress. And so you can have lesions to the central amygdala will affect freezing but not avoidance, and lesions to the BNST will affect this avoidance but not this freezing. Meanwhile, lesions to another shared component in the thalamus will affect the sort of strength of both freezing or avoidance-like responses. Okay, so the general idea, as I take it, is that specificity can emerge through the combination and recombination of primitive elements that are shared. And so you can imagine that on a piano, you can play incredibly different songs by using the same keys or low-level components. And so I think that as far as basic emotions are concerned, as long as there's some kind of specificity that emerges in the way that the various elements come together in the affect program, there's no problem if some of those low-level components are recycled between programs. I'm noticing that my time is getting short, so I'll have to be a little less detailed from here on out. If I end up giving the part on MVPA short shrift, feel free to ask about that in the Q&A. This is the part I'll probably go through the most quickly. So there are just a couple objections that you might raise. So one would be, well, basic emotion theory is compatible with overlap in general. It's just that the specific patterns of overlap in the study fit better with the psychological constructionist model, suggesting a role for memory or concepts in our use of emotions. And yeah, here, Lindquist et al. Claim that the amygdala is not actually a fear area, but an area for novelty detecting novel situations, and that the orbitofrontal cortex is not for anger per se, but is actually involved generally in linking your interoceptive, so what's going on in your body, to exteroceptive, what kind of stimuli you're experiencing, stimuli together. And I have some thoughts about these kind of specific mappings, but I want to talk about MVPA. So I will just gloss over that, and you can sort of ask me what I think about these mappings. The basic response is I think they're kind of provisional and vague, but suggestive. And there's some actually better lines of research now that support psychological constructionist theory a bit better. Okay. The second objection you might have on behalf of the psychological constructionist is just that, well, there's no positive support for basic emotion theory at this point. We've seen kind of centuries of failures to identify these specific signatures, and so attempts to sort of save it are just saving the phenomenon by adding epicycles to the theory. And here I want to argue that multi-voxel pattern analysis studies provide some kind of at least initial support for the distributed overlapping picture that I've been suggesting. In a univariate analysis of fMRI data, you take each voxel or each predefined region of interest as its own statistical test. So you say, is this area significantly modulated by, say, fear or anxiety? And you test that individually for each voxel or region of interest. Currently, there is a methodological revolution taking place in functional MRI research, and this is the use of machine learning algorithms to do what's called multi-voxel pattern analysis. So in this way of doing neuroimaging, you take fMRI data of people who are experiencing particular stimulus or task categories. Here, say an image of a shoe versus an image of a cat. And then you take fMRI bold data, of many scans of participants engaging in these stimuli or categories, and you train a pattern classifier to see if it can extract a pattern that obtains between multiple voxels to diagnose which category member a new scan belongs to. So in this kind of paradigm, you would use a bunch of scans of shoes, a bunch of scans of cats, and train a classifier, and then you would take, in a sort of leave one out cross-validation paradigm, you would take a novel scan and ask the classifier which category it belongs to, and above chance classification in this kind of mode is often considered that the bold signal is informative of the difference between these patterns. In 2016, Saramarki et al. Applied this technique of multi-voxel pattern analysis, which people have done used to do fMRI-based mind reading, to emotions. So they trained participants on neuroimaging data from watching emotional movies and later an imagery condition. And so they had participants watch movies that were intended to elicit fear, anger, disgust, happiness, sadness, surprise, etc., and then trained a pattern classifier on the neural data. And so asked, in effect, whether you can decode what emotion someone was experiencing using MVPA, and they also visualized what voxels drove classification. So this is the basics of the experimental design. They had people watch movies made to elicit, say, fear, anger, or disgust, and then trained a classifier on the neural data to see if you could take a new scan and ask which category it belonged to. The main findings are that a classifier could distinguish basic emotions from each other with above chance accuracy, and so the classifier could distinguish someone who is watching these emotional movies, say anger versus fear, that the classifier performs that individual regions are actually not successful for classification. So if you sort of take all of the regions that are sort of used to identify these patterns, individual regions are not diagnostic, but distributed patterns are. And they also, as you can see here, visualized which voxels were most important for driving classification across these different emotions. So you have these distributed overlapping patterns. Since my time's getting short, I will say that there are some worries that you might have about the study. So one would be, are these really, getting at emotions? So they were watching, silent movie clips meant to elicit the emotion, and you might think that, if there's some kind of visual difference, like all of the fear-inducing movies had a monster in them and all of the happiness-inducing movies had a flower in them, that the sort of visual data, this just difference in visual representations or something that's completely extraneous to emotions could be driving classification, which is a good worry to have. One sort of sanity check on this sort of thing is they actually trained the classifier on data from participants who were internally generating an emotion and tested it on data from the participants who were watching the movie and vice versa, and trained a classifier on the movie. And that achieved classification success that was kind of similar to the individual condition. And the sort of second sanity check is just that many of the regions that appeared to be driving classification were in fact limbic areas, or things that you would expect to crop up in neuroimaging of emotions. So there's a lot more to say about this. Maybe I'll take just 3 more minutes and wrap up. The first thing to say is, the first thing to say is that there are challenges for using this kind of multi-voxel pattern analysis to say that the brain really does have basic emotion categories. And I think the easiest one to point out is just, well, it appears now we can distinguish anger from fear based on a distributed pattern of bold response in a network. But it's also possible that if we had taken, we could also train a classifier to recognize, say, the difference between white-hot rage, irritation, being kind of miffed, and so forth, sort of varieties of anger. And so just that we can discriminate categories using a pattern classifier doesn't sort of mean that those categories are good psychological categories or constructs. So that's something we could talk more about. I want to wrap up in a couple minutes with my concluding remarks. The first is a set of lessons for the philosophy of emotions. So if the picture I've portrayed is right, then the brain may in fact respect basic emotion theory in the form of distributed overlapping brain networks. And this is suggestive of the kind of hidden unity strategy that I mentioned, that maybe there are biomarkers for basic emotions and our sort of univariate tools have been ill-suited to find them. But multivariate techniques may actually provide new tools for resisting this no one-to-one correspondence thesis. So just as neuroscientists have used multivoxel pattern analysis to see if you can find networks associated with particular emotions, people doing physiological research have used pattern classifiers to see whether you can extract patterns from multiple physiological variables like heart rate, autonomic activity, et cetera, to get better biomarkers for emotions. Rainville et al. Would be an example. And this discussion also suggests a broader lesson for the philosophy of neuroscience. So here in fMRI, analysis methods make different implicit or explicit assumptions about what kinds of structures are going to be relevant for our analysis. And so you can target sort of regions versus networks. You can target smaller or larger regions. If you're doing pattern classification, you can choose classifiers that are sensitive to different types of bold patterns, like linear versus nonlinear. There are many neuroscientists, including Lindquist and colleagues, and Russ Poldrack and Michael Anderson, and many philosophers who want to make neuroimaging in some way the measure of our psychology. But as I think the difference between univariate meta-analyses and multivoxel pattern analyses show, whether psychological categories do or don't align with our neuroimaging data will inherently depend on one's choice of analysis. So there's no methodologically innocent way of saying that our psychology does or does not line up with neuroscience. Thanks very much.